I caught him in the stairwell again and didn't slow down. I jammed my key in, slipped inside, and locked fast. I checked the peephole. He stood across the hall and stared at my door like it was a TV. I've been seeing him for days, and I kept trying to make it normal. Same building, same hallways, people overlap, right? Except he didn't overlap, he hovered. I'd hear the stairwell door click and my stomach would drop because I already knew what face would be on the other side. He always picked the same spots too. Half a flight down where the light flickers, the dead corner by the mailboxes, the stretch of hallway where the camera can't really see. I tested that once. I walked past the lobby camera slow, then cut around and came back the other way. He stepped out from the blind corner like he'd been standing there counting seconds. I started changing my routine just to prove I could. I left at random times. I took the back stairs. I parked on a different street. He still showed up at the right moment, every time like he'd built his day around mine. I'd come home early, thinking I'd beat him, and I'd catch him already inside the lobby, not checking his phone, not reading anything, just standing with his head angled like he was listening for my keys. I'd leave late, thinking I'd shake him, and I'd see him through the stairwell window reflection, one floor below, perfectly still, waiting for me to start down. At first, I tried to stare him down. I tried to look bigger, like that matters. He just stared back, dead-eyed, like he was watching a show he'd already seen. One afternoon, I snapped and told him to stop following me. He didn't answer, didn't argue, didn't even smirk. He just shifted his weight and kept those eyes on my hands like my mouth didn't exist. That's when I realized this wasn't about conversation. It was about access. One night I came home and stopped dead. My shoes sat in a neat line. I don't line my shoes. My kitchen chair faced the window instead of the table. My bathroom mirror had a clean swipe through the fog like someone had leaned in close. I stood there with my grocery bag still hanging from my wrist, skin crawling, trying to decide if I should back out in the hall and call someone or lock myself inside with whatever had been in there. I locked it. I always locked it. The lock clicked like normal, and that somehow made it worse because it meant whoever did this didn't need to force anything. I walked room to room with my phone recording. Nothing missing. Nothing stolen. Just touched. That was the fucking point. The drawer I never used sat open a crack. The shower curtain hung wrong. A towel that should have been on the rack sat folded on the counter like a neat little joke. My bedspread had a crease down the middle like someone sat at the edge and got up careful. I opened closets. I checked behind the shower curtain anyway. I checked under the bed anyway. I checked the windows and pressed on the frames like pressure would tell me the truth. Everything was intact. My place looked normal enough for a cop to shrug at, which made my skin crawl harder. After that, I started living like I had an invisible roommate who hated me. I took pictures before I left. I left a pen angled on the counter. I left a cabinet door half closed. I left my keys on the same hook and counted them like that meant anything. I bought a cheap door wedge and shoved it under the door at night, then kicked it loose in the morning and checked the rubber for fresh scuffs. I bought little stick-on alarms and slapped one on my bedroom door and one on the front. I kept my phone charged and recording half the time, not because it helped, but because doing nothing felt like dying. I taped a hair across my bedroom door before I left the next morning. I came back and found it broken on the floor. My stomach flipped so hard I had to grab the wall. I stared at that hair like it was a message written in a language I suddenly understood. I did it again with a second hair. Broken again. I did it with a tiny strip of clear tape folded so it would tear if the door moved. Torn. I dusted a stupid pinch of flour by the threshold like some old detective trick. Smudged. Every time, the same result, clean and simple. He got in, he did what he wanted, he left, and he let me find it. I started coming home on purpose at weird hours, not because I had plans, but because I wanted to catch him in the act. I took the stairs up 2 at a time, moved quiet on the last flight, and turned the corner fast. Twice I saw him near my door, too close, body angled toward it like he'd been listening through the wood. The first time I froze, and he walked away like I wasn't even worth reacting to. The second time I got mad enough to move. I shoved past him, jammed my key in, and he stayed right there with his face turned toward my hands, like he was memorizing how long it took me to open my own door. I went to the landlord with my phone full of photos and timestamps and my hand still trembling. I told him someone had access to my unit, that the building keys had to be compromised, that maintenance needed to change the cylinder, anything. He didn't even stand up. He glanced at my screen like he was checking sports scores. He shrugged and told me to be neighborly. I felt my face burn. I told him this wasn't a neighborly issue. This was someone entering my home. He said he couldn't accuse tenants without proof. I told him I had proof. He said it wasn't proof of a crime. It was proof I was stressed. I even knocked on the unit next to his because I was desperate and angry and out of options. A woman cracked the door, saw my face, and immediately tried to close it. I shoved my foot in the gap and asked if she knew who he was, if he had a key, if anyone had been in my place. She snapped that she didn't know anything and told me to get the fuck away from her door. She slammed it so hard my knuckles rang where they'd been on the frame. That night, I set the wedge hard and chained the door and sat with my phone on record again, trying to catch sound, trying to catch anything. Around midnight, I heard a soft scrape at the door, then a little pressure on the knob, slow, patient. The wedge held. The knob stopped, then started again, a tiny twist like someone testing limits. I didn't move. I couldn't make myself breathe. After a minute, it stopped, and I heard one step in the hall, then nothing. I checked the peephole and saw empty carpet, empty wall like the building itself was pretending. That night, a printed photo slid under my door. Me carrying groceries, time-stamped, shot from inside the building. The paper scraped across the carpet and stopped like it had weight. I didn't touch it at first. I stood over it and watched my own legs in the picture, watched my own face turned slightly toward the camera, watched the hallway behind me in crisp focus. The timestamp was from the same evening. The angle wasn't from outside. It was from my floor from down the hall, low like whoever took it crouched. It hit me all at once. He didn't just watch me. He documented me. He wanted me to know he could. I tried the landlord again. I knocked hard enough to hurt. No answer. I called his number. Voicemail. I stood in the stairwell listening to the building breathe and realized I was alone in the only place that was supposed to be mine. I called the non-emergency line and waited with the photo on the table like it was evidence and also a threat. When an officer finally showed up, he looked around fast, checked the lock, and told me to keep documenting and call if I caught the guy actually breaking in. I told him he was already inside my home. The officer nodded like he'd heard it 100 times and didn't have anywhere to put it. After that, I stopped pretending I could sleep normally. I sat on my couch with my shoes on. I kept my keys and that shitty spray can in my fist until my fingers cramped. I listened for steps in the hall and tried to tell the difference between my upstairs neighbor and him. I didn't cook because the sound of the stove felt too loud. I didn't shower until daylight because I hated being trapped behind a curtain. I kept checking the peephole, and sometimes I'd see nothing, and sometimes I'd see him across the hall, facing my door, motionless like he was waiting for the moment I stopped paying attention. I didn't sleep. I stacked a chair under the knob and sat on the floor with my keys in my fist until sunrise. He offered to carry my boxes the first week. I let him. I watched him look past me into my apartment while he pretended to focus on the weight. It wasn't curiosity. It was inventory. He clocked the chain lock, the gap between my door and the frame, the shoes by the wall, the second set of keys on the hook I hadn't even hung up properly yet. He did it fast like he'd practiced. He set the box down and didn't leave right away either. He stood in my doorway with that polite posture people use when they want you to feel rude for closing the door. I said thanks, pushed the door shut, and listened to his keys jingle across the hall. His door was straight across from mine. That part felt chosen. After that, he started knocking for dumb reasons. Sugar, a phone charger, just checking in. The first time I opened because I didn't want to be the new asshole on the floor. He held the request out like bait and kept his eyes flicking over my shoulder. I said no and started to close the door. He didn't step back. He stayed close enough that the chain went tight when I pulled, and I could hear his breath in the crack. Second time, I left the chain on and didn't open more than a few inches. Third time, I didn't open at all. I said no, through the wood, and waited for him to walk away. He didn't. He stood there quiet, like he was trying to teach me that the word no didn't move him. So I stopped opening. I stopped answering. He started waiting outside instead. I'd come home, and he'd already be there, leaning on his doorframe with his phone in his hand, screen dark, like the phone was just an excuse to stand there. He'd look at me, then at my lock, then back at me. No hello, just that little smile that says, I see you noticing me. If I tried to ignore him, he'd make noise, clear his throat, shuffle, tap his keys, anything to force the moment to acknowledge him. If I took the trash out, his door would click open at the exact time I stepped into the hall. If I waited for the elevator, I'd hear that same click behind me, and then he'd slide into the elevator at the last second, like he'd been watching through his peephole. He never pressed a floor button. He'd just ride down with me, eyes on the mirror so he could stare without turning his head, then step out when I stepped out. He made it feel like coincidence on paper and like a trap in my body. I emailed the property manager about unwanted contact and loitering. I got a canned reply about neighbor disputes and communication. Communicate what exactly? I went to the front desk and asked about moving units. They told me I'd lose my deposit and pay another fee. I stood there with my hands clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms, and I realized I was being charged money to escape a guy they wouldn't even tell to stop hovering. The first time I tried to confront him in the hall, he switched faces so fast it made me dizzy. I came out with groceries, and he stepped into my path like he timed it. He reached for a bag, and I yanked it back. I told him I had it. His smile twitched just for a second like a muscle failed. Then it came back tighter. He said I was being paranoid and that I didn't have to be like that. He said it like I owed him softness. That night, I heard him pacing the hall. Not walking somewhere, just pacing, back and forth, stopping outside my door, then moving again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to breathe loud enough to give him anything. I came home one evening and found a bag of trash lean against my door, leaking. I shoved it aside with my foot and stepped into something wet. He'd ripped open old food and smeared it on my doormat like a dog marking a porch. It wasn't a random spill. It was placed, grease dragged in a half circle, soft chunks mashed into the fibers. The smell hit hard and sweet and rotten at the same time, and it clung to my nose like it wanted to live there. I stood there staring at it, and my first thought wasn't, who did this? Because I already knew. My first thought was, he's making my front door his. He's making me touch his shit to get into my own home. I took photos with my hands shaking. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't want to leave it there either, because leaving it felt like surrender. I put gloves on, scrubbed until my wrists burned, and I gagged so hard my eyes watered. I shoved the whole mat into a trash bag like it was contaminated and carried it downstairs. The desk guy glanced at it and didn't ask a single question. He didn't even look surprised. I cleaned it, gagging, and he knocked again 10 minutes later. I didn't answer. The banging kept going, steady, like he had nowhere else to put his anger. Not a knock, a slam, full arm. The chain on my door clinked with each hit. My picture frame rattled on the entry table. A neighbor down the hall cracked their door open, looked at me, looked at him, and shut it again like their hinges were afraid too. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, trying to decide what would humiliate me more, calling the cops and being treated like I was overreacting, or staying quiet and letting him decide the rules. I called building security. They showed up late and acted bored. They walked up like I called them because someone was smoking in the stairwell. They didn't ask to see the mess. They didn't ask if he'd threatened me. They just asked if I knew him, like knowing him would make this normal. They knocked on his door, and he opened it calm as hell, like he'd been waiting for his audience. He stood behind them with a fake calm face and that polite little smile that makes you want to punch someone. He told them he was just checking in, like I was the weird one for not wanting him at my door. Security turned to me and gave me that look people give when they want you to stop making their job harder. One of them said something like, "Try to keep it down," To him, like they were warning a loud TV. Then they left, and he stayed in his doorway after they walked away, smiling like he'd won a tiny case in court. I slammed my door and locked it so hard the frame rattled. I sat on the floor behind it because my legs felt wrong. I waited for more banging. What I got instead was his lock turning, slow, and his footsteps drifting away like he was satisfied. The next day, my package went missing. The day after that, my car had a long scratch down the side, deep enough to catch a fingernail. The package was boring stuff, not even worth stealing, which somehow made it worse. It meant it wasn't about the item. It was about me. I found an empty box later in the trash room, ripped open, my shipping label still stuck on it like someone wanted me to see my own name tossed away. I went to the front desk and asked about cameras. They told me the mail shelves weren't really in view. Of course they weren't. I called the delivery company and got the same dead script. Delivered. I went back upstairs and my stomach dropped because he was in the hall, like he'd been waiting for me to return with nothing in my hands. He gave me that small nod, that tiny acknowledgement that said, "Yes, I can reach you even when you're not home." The car scratch hit harder because it cost money and it was public. I walked up to it in the lot and saw the line running clean and long from my rear door to the front fender. Not an accident, not a bump, a steady drag, like he wanted the sound of it. I ran my nail down it and it snagged, and my throat tightened up so fast it felt like I'd swallowed something sharp. I filed a police report online. I got an automated email back. That was it. I went to the leasing office with photos and dates and the security call record, and the woman behind the desk asked if I had video. Proof. Like my torn doormat and my scraped car weren't proof. Like I hadn't been changing my whole life around this guy's moods. She suggested I avoid contact like I could avoid my own hallway. I left the office shaking so hard I had to sit on the stairs until my breath came back. I bought a door camera that night because I didn't know what else to do. Not because I wanted one, because I was tired of being told to come back with better evidence while he kept getting braver. I installed it myself. I tightened the screws until my fingers hurt. I watched the app connect and felt this gross mix of relief and anger, like I'd built my own little witness because nobody else would be one. The first night it pointed at his door too, by accident. I almost angled it away, like I was still worried about being fair. Then I remembered the trash. I left it. I barely slept. Every time the hallway made a sound, I checked the feed. Most of it was nothing. Someone stumbling past, the elevator light flickering, a delivery guy leaving. Around 3 a.m., the phone buzzed again, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it because my body already knew what it would be. The first night it pointed at his door too, by accident. He came out at 3 a.m., stared in my lens, and raised his middle finger slow, like a promise. A thud hit the shared wall during dinner and made my fork jump. Then another, then a sharp cry that cut off fast. I stood up, pressed my ear to the drywall, and heard dragging sounds. I heard something heavy bump the baseboard like someone got tossed. I went into the hallway and knocked on their door. No answer. I knocked harder. The building stayed quiet around me, like everyone practiced ignoring it. I called the police. They came, talked to him at the door, and left. 10 minutes later, the wall took another hit, and the crying started again, lower, like whoever it was had learned not to waste breath. Our apartment sat back to back like cheap Lego. I could hear his sink run. He could hear my shower. That night, the wall didn't just carry sound. It shook. The plate on my table rattled like someone bumped it. And that's what messed with me. How physical it felt, like somebody's rage had mass. I waited for somebody else to react. I waited for a door to open, for a neighbor to yell, for anything. Nothing. I stood in that hallway with my hands still sore from knocking, and I could feel eyes behind peepholes, but nobody moved. A lock clicked down the hall. That was it. People didn't freeze because they didn't hear it. They froze because they did. The cops didn't treat it like what it was. They treated it like an inconvenience. They didn't ask to come inside. He stood in his doorway calm, dressed, smiling too hard, like he'd rehearsed. I caught a smell from inside, bleachy, sweet, wrong, but it was one breath, and then the door was shut and the officers were already walking away. I called again later when the wall hit twice in a row and the crying came back. Dispatch asked if I saw anything. I said no, I heard it. They told me they'd already sent units earlier. End of conversation. One officer on a later call leaned close and told me, not unkind, that if they came out again and found nothing, the building could tag me as a nuisance. He said it like advice, like I should protect my record. I nodded like I understood, then stood in my kitchen and listened to the wall hit again. That night, I smacked my palm against the wall like an idiot, once just to see if it would stop. The sounds paused. Then he hit back, 3 hard knocks, slow, deliberate, like he was saying, I hear you. Then the dragging started again, quieter. I sat on my couch with my shoes on until sunrise, because I didn't feel safe enough to get comfortable. After that, it turned into a schedule. Impacts, a short burst of sound, a long stretch of nothing. Sometimes I'd hear his TV, cartoons on low, and it made my skin crawl because I never saw a kid in the hallway. No backpack, no shoes, just him sliding in and out at odd hours with heavy trash bags he tied like he was packing meat. I started writing down times because that's what everyone tells you to do when they don't want to help. Document. I had notes on my phone like a creep. Tuesday 11:47, bang. Wednesday 2:13, crying. Friday 1:02, dragging. I emailed the building office. I attached my call log. I got one reply. He denies any disturbance. Cool. Of course he denies it. I went down to the office the next day and cornered the manager in front of the mailboxes. I showed her my call log and my notes. She kept her voice low, like volume was the real problem. She said without a report and visible evidence, there was nothing actionable. I asked if she'd knock on his door herself. She said no. I asked if she'd let her own kid sleep next to that wall. She stared at the floor and told me to stop being aggressive. I tried neighbors too, because I didn't know what else to do. One woman looked past me into the hall and said, "Don't start trouble." Another guy shrugged and said, "Probably a couple." Like couple made the sounds okay. Like the word turned to kids cry into background noise. They shut their doors and left me holding alone. A week later, the hallway stank of chemicals. I walked past his door and saw tape around the edges, like he didn't want air moving. I tried the landlord. The landlord told me I was dramatic. That smell lived in my nose. It burned. It mixed with something hot and sour underneath. Like wet laundry left too long. His door looked sealed. Tape over the crack at the bottom. Tape up the sides. Tape around the peephole. Who tapes a door like that unless they're keeping a smell in or keeping a person in? I called the landlord again and didn't even try to sound polite. I said there were screams. I said the door was taped like a fucking lab. I said there might be a kid. He cut me off, called me dramatic, said I was harassing a tenant, said if I kept it up he'd note my file. I asked him what he'd note if a child died next door. He hung up. That week dragged like my own punishment. The wall would go quiet for hours and I'd start doubting myself. Then a hit would land so hard it made my cabinet rattle and I'd feel my heart slam. I stopped playing music. I stopped cooking anything that took time. I ate fast because I kept thinking if it happens again, I need to be able to move. December rolled in and the building put up cheap holiday lights in the lobby. People smiled in the mailroom like this place was normal. I'd walk past his door and the tape would be fresh, pressed down again, like he kept resealing it. I'd catch that chemical bite and speed up without meaning to. I hated that my body learned fear like it was routine. On Christmas Eve, the fire alarm went off. Not a drill. Real. I opened my door and got punched in the face by hot air and that chemical stink. The hallway looked like it breathed. Heat shimmered near the ceiling. Smoke crawled low and gray. People poured out in pajamas, coughing, swearing, grabbing cats and phones and nothing else. Somebody yelled, "Fire," like the alarm wasn't already screaming. I didn't grab anything. I moved toward his door because that's where the heat came from. His door didn't open all the way. It cracked like someone shoved it with their shoulder and couldn't manage more. Their door cracked open and a kid stumbled out coughing, barefoot, skin gray with soot. I grabbed the kid and dragged them down the stairs. The neighbor burst out behind us and grabbed my sleeve, trying to pull the kid back like property. The kid felt light, too light. They didn't cry. They just hacked and tried to breathe and kept staring at the hallway like it would bite. Their feet slapped the stairs and left ash prints. I wrapped my arm under theirs and hauled because their knees kept folding. His hand clamped my sleeve and yanked. He didn't say help. He didn't say the kid was hurt. He just grabbed like we were stealing a TV. I smelled him, sweat, smoke, that same chemical bite, and I felt this animal panic rise up because he was close enough to drag us back inside. I kicked his shin, tore free, and kept moving. He followed to the landing, screaming ugly shit until smoke drove him back inside. He limped after us, coughing, shouting that I was a bitch, that I was kidnapping, that the kid was his. The smoke thickened and he backed up, eyes watering, then turned and disappeared into the heat like he'd rather burn than let go. Outside, cold air hit my lungs and I almost puked. The kid folded over and coughed black spit onto the sidewalk. Neighbors clustered like a crowd at a show. Phones up, recording. Somebody tossed a blanket at us and then stepped back like touching the kid might stain them. Sirens came. Firefighters rushed in. Medics dropped down and started checking the kid, asking questions, shining lights in their eyes. The kid flinched at every touch and kept scanning the doorway like they expected him to come out again. I kept myself between them and that entrance without thinking, like my body picked a job and didn't ask permission. Firefighters hauled him out later, cuffed, spitting, still fighting. The hallway filled with neighbors filming, whispering, acting shocked like they hadn't heard the same sound for months. He twisted in the cuffs and tried to lunge toward the kid until 2 firefighters and a cop shoved him forward. He kept yelling that everyone was lying. He kept calling me names like that mattered. People who'd ignored months of banging suddenly had opinions, suddenly had cameras, suddenly had, oh my God, faces like they were innocent. Someone from management showed up wearing a scarf like this was a holiday inconvenience. He tried to talk to the cops about units and insurance. I told him I called. I told him he'd called me dramatic. He looked right at me and said, "This isn't the time." I laughed and coughed smoke at the same time, and he walked away. When it was over, the building went quiet again. That train quiet. Doors shut. Locks clicked. People went back to their units and kept their heads down like survival meant forgetting fast. I washed my hands for an hour when I got back in. The smell stayed anyway. The walls stayed too. Thin. Close. Never safe.